Welcome to Module 3, Menus and Buttons and Choices, oh my. Now don't turn it off. I know it doesn't sound very exciting, but this is a crucial module to get to know your big girl camera. Without this module, you're going to have a very hard time understanding weeks 2 and weeks 3 and beyond. So it's really important that you get your camera out, pause when you need to, see if you can find what you're looking for. If not, write it down, and then you can go back and research it later. So like I said before, there's a lot of different cameras out there. Even within the Canon line, the Nikon line, there's so many different makes, models, years. Then there's the new mirrorless cameras. So I can't possibly tell you where every button is, but everything's going to be named similarly. So you can find out specific to your camera, and that's going to be one of your assignments this week. I'm going to give you some key phrases, buttons, and menu items that I want you to find because they're going to be really important to your success going forward. So let's go ahead and jump right into this. So we're going to review some important vocabulary, things that no matter what classes you take, you're going to hear these words. Some key settings that I want you to set on your camera right away. We're just going to set them and leave them for the rest of the class. I'm going to give you some ideas on how you can search on YouTube to find things specific to your camera. And then we're going to walk through kind of the general camera buttons and menus. I'm going to tell you what it does, why it's important, and whether you need to worry about it at this stage of the game. And we are going to reinforce all of this with an assignment, and you better do it because that's the only way that you're going to learn. So it's not the camera, but who's behind it. So I can't tell you how many times I've heard, oh, you have a really good camera. Well, I do have a good camera, but if you don't know how to use it, I have a funny story that I tell about my husband, and he just loves when I bring this up. But we were out doing something, and I had my big professional camera, my big professional lens, and I was taking photos of him and my dad and my brothers, and I wanted to be in the picture because I'm never in the picture. So I handed him my camera and I said, take some pictures of me. Well, he had a really, really expensive camera in his hands and the pictures were so bad. I said, I'm sorry, but I have to use you as my example from now on. Because he didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know how to use the camera and everything was out of focus. It was pretty much a disaster. It was funny, but I will use that as an example for the rest of my life. So let's go into some camera lingo. All right, so the very first and basic is exposure. Why do I have a picture of a white, gray, and black square on the screen? Well, let me tell you why. So your camera is really just a little computer, okay? And so programmed in there is a little algorithm, and it says, take all the lights and the darks and the colors and combine them. And I want them to be, when you add it all up, the perfect exposure is 18% gray. Okay? Kind of weird, but that's what the gray represents. So gray is sort of that middle perfect exposure. The white is too bright, the black is too dark. Now this is a broad generalization because sometimes you want something to be black, sometimes you want something to be white. But that's more for, we're going to talk about that more when I do a manual class. So let's turn these squares into pictures. Okay? So this is just a regular picture to represent those squares. So if you look at the picture on the left, these are my nephews, they're super cute, but look, it is overexposed, it's too bright. So where the sun is coming through, if I were to print this picture, there's no detail there. It's blown out. So you'll often hear the term, the highlights are blown. That means if you print that picture, there will be no ink that comes out of the printer in those places where the highlights are blown. So you want some detail, even if it's bright. So this picture is overexposed. Now go to the right side. This is underexposed. It's dark. So you can see in some of the blacks or the shadow areas, if you were to print that, it would just be a solid black. There would be no detail there. So ultimately what you want is the middle picture where nothing's too bright, nothing's too dark. If you were to print it, you would get detail in every area of the picture. And that's how your camera measures. It's just in your camera's mind, if you want to call it that, it's aiming for that 18% gray. So once you take control of the camera, you can start to determine how bright or how dark you want it. You're not leaving it up to the camera's computer. All right, so that brings us to the exposure triangle. And don't freak out. The exposure triangle is not that hard or difficult or confusing. Let's break it down. So any camera, whether it's your iPhone, your Samsung Galaxy, your GoPro, your old point and shoot, your film camera, if you used to put rolls of film in there, it all works off the same principle, and that is there's a combination of three things that come together and create the exposure. So I put the perfectly exposed picture in the middle of the triangle so you know that the aperture, the ISO, and the shutter speed come together and they make that middle picture. So if one of those things is off, they either become too bright or too dark. And so you can switch any combination of those three things to get that right exposure, but each one has a different effect on the picture. And those are the things that we're going to learn in great detail in weeks 2 and 3. This week I just want to tell you what they are, and then we'll go into great detail in weeks 2 and 3. So aperture is the opening of your lens. So if I were to go past this glass, there's a ring in there and it opens and it closes, okay? And that's called an aperture ring. So when I say aperture or f-stop, that's what it's referring to. And week 2 is all about aperture. We will learn about that inside and out. So don't worry if you don't understand it right now. Same thing, any lens. The opening of the lens is the aperture. It goes small, big, small, big. And that just lets in more light, less light, more light, less light. Shutter speed is how fast your shutter opens. So literally think of it like a curtain, and it opens and it closes. And the shutter speed is just, does it open and close really fast? Does it open, let a lot of light in, and then close? All right, so we're gonna learn all about that in week 3. Now the third variable is the ISO. I don't even know what that stands for, but if you're old enough to remember film, you used to buy rolls of film 100, 200, 400, 1600, and the bigger the number, the more sensitive it was to light. And that's the same in a digital camera. The more the number goes up, the more sensitive to light it becomes. So all three of these things have ways of letting in more light or less light. The aperture opens more to let more light in. It closes to keep light out. The shutter, it opens longer to let light in. It opens faster and closes faster to keep light out. The ISO, if you were drawing a picture, if you had a white, say this is a white board and I'm drawing a picture. The ISO, if it's not very sensitive to light, it's going to take longer and more effort to draw that picture, okay? But if I make it more sensitive to light, the light is going to barely touch that picture and it's going to make it. So it's just a way the sensor, how sensitive is to light. And there are some drawbacks to all these different things that you manipulate, and we're going to talk about that. So let's talk about, here's another vocabulary word that doesn't need to be scary. It's called depth of field. And depth of field, all you need to know about that is how much of your picture is in focus, okay? So if I were to, let's look at these two examples. The picture on the left, you can see that her eyes are in focus, her face is in focus, but everything behind her is out of focus, and everything in front of her is out of focus. That means there's a very shallow depth of field. So if I were taking a picture of this laptop, and I focused on this plane, remember planes in geometry? If I had a shallow depth of field, it means that everything in front of my computer would be out of focus and everything behind the computer would be out of focus, and just this screen would be in focus. And you can do a lot of really creative, cool things with this. This is one of my favorite things to manipulate in the camera, and I'm going to teach you all about it in week 2. Now look, by contrast, the picture on the right. The picture on the right was taken with a big girl camera, but it looks a little bit more like a phone camera because everything's in focus. The snowman is in focus and the house behind it is in focus. Everything from front to back is in focus. This means that it has a very large depth of field. So if I use the computer example again, The front of the desk would be in focus, the computer would be in focus, this would be in focus, I would be in focus, because there's a large depth of field here. So we use that generally for landscapes. You usually want landscapes to be really in focus. And then shallow depths of field are often used for food photography, or if you're trying to isolate focus to one certain, if you want your eye to go to one certain thing in the picture, you can use a really shallow depth of field to take it right to the focus part. So let's look at some examples. This is my daughter. This is her senior pictures. And what I did was we were kind of standing in some weeds. And so I placed her with some weeds in front of her and some weeds behind her. And then I shot through the weeds with a very, very small, shallow depth of field. And what that does is it blurs out everything in front of her, blurs out everything in back of her. It makes her pop, and it gives me a place where I could put some words for an invitation on the left. So those are ways that you can use a shallow depth of field. Here's another example. I shot through several people to my subject, and I hit the focus on her eyes and her expression. And you can see that the other kids are laughing and that there's more kids there. So this adds depth to the picture. It adds some visual interest that you don't get. So these are things you can do, and you can see everything behind her is out of focus. So it's got a very, very shallow depth of field. Now by contrast, let's look at this. This is on the beach with my big girl camera, but I've got a large depth of field, okay? So you can see the waves are in focus, the sandcastle is in focus, the clouds are in focus. Generally, everything in the picture is in focus, which sometimes you want to do that. So you have to know how to manipulate your camera. Out of focus, in focus, shallow depth of field, large depth of field. Now here's a picture of the Brooklyn Bridge and the New York City skyline. So I could have shot this at a shallow depth of field, but then I would have gotten blurry buildings in the background, and I didn't want that. I wanted them to be tack sharp. So I used a large depth of field so that I can show everything in the bridge all the way to the city. Everything's in focus. And I did that by choice, consciously. It didn't just happen that way.